Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome. My name is Rick Byros. I am the president and owner of Innovative Publishing, the parent company of MedTech Intelligence, and I will be your host for today's MedTech Intelligence virtual event. The title of the event is High Risk AI under the European AI Act. Must-know strategies for medical device companies to achieve regulatory excellence. And today's webinar is sponsored by Matrix Requirements. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. You are listening in using GoToWebinar's web-based broadcast system using your computer's speaker system by default. There is no call-in numbers. If you have problems with audio, please try to increase your computer's volume. If you are having audio issues, please log out and try to reconnect. Please contact Veronica Allen via the chat box to let her know if you are having any other sound issues. Today's event will consist of a 45 to 50-minute discussion by our speakers, followed by a Q&A. We have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing in your questions into the chat pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session after the presentation. There are no handouts today, but you will be receiving an email with a link to the recording directly from Matrix Requirements in about 48 hours. Let me introduce our presenters for today. And we have, I think, 4 of them, and I'm going to introduce all of them now, and they will be coming on screen periodically as their session comes into session. Our first speaker is Anne Van Kronkelsven, who is the RAQA manager at Matrix Requirements. She is a driven, dynamic professional who thrives on new challenges in making a positive impact for the world. With a PhD in bioengineering, she has always been fascinated by the intersections of science, innovation, and business. After years of honing her skills in regulatory affairs and quality assurance, Anne has become a true master, often lecturing at l'École Polytechnique de Louvain. Our next speaker is Leon Dorn, who is a quality and regulatory affairs and is an independent consultant. Leon has been working for more than 15 years in the medical device industry with within quality and regulatory affairs, and currently works as an independent consultant. Over the past 10 years, he's gained substantial experience working in software medical devices, and particular devices enabled by AI or artificial intelligence. Our next speaker is Dr. Tatiana Ivas, a legal and policy officer for the European Commission. Tatiana, as I said, is the legal and policy officer in the European Commission, the AI Policy Development and Coordination Unit. She's one of the key members of the European Commission's drafting and negotiating team for the AI Act, primarily overseeing the technical requirements, standardization, conformity assessment, marketing surveillance, and cybersecurity. Furthermore, she is responsible for the coordination and development of guidance on the relationships. Tibor Zekmeister is our next speaker, who is in regulatory compliance, and Tibor is an entrepreneur in the medical device sector with over a decade of experience. He specializes in regulatory compliance and quality management systems. His role is an external auditor and founder in health tech space, and which has equipped him with the adaptively guide startups to established companies through the complexity of European regulations like 2007-7045 MDR, ensuring their successful market entry and enhanced patient outcomes. Welcome, team. And now, Anne, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rick. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm really excited to have you all here because in the last months, AI is really booming. It's a buzzword. It's everywhere. And with the European AI Act coming, it's also getting a regulatory framework, which is super interesting, especially for industries like the medical device industry, which will have to cope with its own regulation, and on top of that, then the new AI Act and its specific requirements. So what we want to do today in this webinar is to get a better understanding of what the AI Act means for medical device industry, to get some strategies, some practical tools, some insights in how to meet the obligations, what is the status, and how to deal with standards, in the future harmonized standards, strategies to be compliant with this new regulation, and also to ensure and maintain that compliance. So I'm really happy with having speakers here from that can look at this topic from different angles. I guess Tatiana will still join afterwards, but for now, let's get started because we have quite a lot of topics to discuss. So maybe first, to set the scene and go back to the basics, first question would be, what is AI? Because we're talking about the AI Act, we're talking about AI technologies and medical devices, but what is considered to be artificial intelligence? What is AI? And then further, what is high risk under the AI Act, and then specifically in the context of medical devices? And let me pass that question first to Leon. So
yeah, sure. So thanks for your introduction as well and on the webinar. I think it's good to point out, right, that we've heard a lot about AI and a lot of AI techniques coming up, and I think we've seen mainly over the recent years first machine learning and then deep learning coming in. And then later on, we're also seeing other models, generative AI models, and even multi-purpose AI models. This is clearly interesting developments. And clearly, there are also a lot of organizations that feel that, as mentioned in the introduction, AI is a buzzword, and a lot of organizations are tending to try to incorporate forms of AI to attract some attention to the organizations. But when it comes to the AI Act, and specifically what the regulation will entail, there is a very specific definition that's incorporated within the final text. The definition has gone through several changes, and initially the idea was that the OECD definition would be implemented into the regulation. And I think the OECD definition finally was a good basis to develop the definition, but there's still a number of changes were implemented. If you look at what it actually says, is that AI systems can have various levels of autonomy. That means that software systems that exercise some kind of autonomy as to the role and the function they can fulfill, that could potentially be an AI system. And then there's additional qualifications, for example, whether it can infer from specific outputs, it can infer specific outputs. And again, and these can be predictions, content, recommendations, or even decisions that can influence physical or virtual environments. So it's, I would say the definition is slightly wider than just, for example, the machine learning and deep learning systems, but also, for example, the generative AI models, but also other systems that might potentially fulfill those roles, even though they're not using specific deep learning techniques, for example.
I think you have mentioned quite an important point here, because usually we sometimes have the issue that we really cannot even analyze if our technology is in the scope or not within the scope of a certain regulation or directive. And I think the negative news here is that there, as you said, there is quite a broad coverage of what AI is, because maybe some people hoped, okay, maybe ChatGPT will be included, but maybe more basic approaches or machine learning approaches would be excluded, which is unfortunately not the case. But at the same time, this is also good news, because if I know what the definition is and what's potentially included or excluded, this also means that it's much easier for me to see if this legislation and also regulation applies or not. Maybe to have a comparison to the MDR, even though we have a definition within the MDR what the medical devices are not, I think at least in this round here, we could think of at least, I don't know, 10 fringe cases where it's not that easy to say, is this really a medical device or a wellness device or a combination of both? So I see the negative and the positive sides here, that at least you could create some kind of, I would say, intended purpose or technological intended purpose for your technology, and then say, okay, would that fall into the scope of the EU AI regulation or not? So that's the positive side I see here.
Okay, that's very interesting. But then when we think about medical devices, how do they fit in the AI Act? We have different classifications. Do all medical devices with AI technology fall within the scope of the AI Act? Are there exceptions? How can medical device teams that are developing devices using AI technology know in which category they would fall in the AI Act?
Yeah, if I can answer that, I think there's 4 items here to consider. The first one is that an AI system, when a medical device uses AI, and the medical device itself will need to undergo the notified body conformity assessment, then clearly it falls within the scope of an high-risk AI system under the AI Act. I think this is the main bulk of the medical devices that are going to be considered high-risk AI. Then there's the question, how about the devices, for example, class 1 devices that will not undergo third-party conformity assessment? Are then not high risk? And indeed, in principle, these devices will mainly fall outside of the category of being high-risk AI devices. So that's the second one. Then there's a third category, and we've had multiple discussions on this, and I'm still a little bit unclear. It would really be helpful if we get Tatjana to join, if we can still get her answer on this as well, or maybe some insights from the European Commission on how they view this, where if you have an AI system that is, for example, developed within the house of a hospital and is only being used in-house in the hospital under Article 5 of the MDR, and it doesn't undergo notified body conformity assessment, but if it would have, it would be a class 2A medical device or higher, then will that be seen as high risk under the AI Act? I think that's still a bit of a question, and there's not necessarily a direct answer that I can provide here. So that's down to interpretation. It does seem that they would need to fulfill some of the high risk requirements under the AI Act. And then I think there's even a last category, which also is slightly unclear. For example, you mentioned it, I think I mentioned it earlier, the large language models, the generative AI models, general purpose AI models, how would they, if they would have some kind of medical intended purpose, where would they fall within this regulation? And also there, I don't think I can give a direct answer. I think still, if it would be a medical device that's potentially certifiable under the MDR, it would go into the AI Act as high risk AI, but potentially also will be qualified as a general purpose AI system. I'm not sure, Tibor, maybe you have any additional thoughts here?
I mean, the tricky situation I'm currently seeing is that, as you mentioned, I think it is Article 6 defines when we would have to include it as a high-risk device. And from the 2 criteria, number 1 is quite easy. If you need to have some kind of conformity assessment procedure that includes a notified body or similar organization, yes, that's criterion number 1, which is quite easy. But the second one is really tricky for me, because it mainly says that if the AI would contribute to safety or risk activities or have any contribution or impact on that, then it would be seen as a high risk. So for medical devices, this is really tricky, because on the one hand, not every AI feature in your medical device will automatically have the function of providing safety activities. So for example, I could use AI, for example, to, I don't know, detect certain patterns in images to have a more proper diagnosis. This is per se not a risk related, I would say, intended purpose of that module. But at the same time, let's be honest, if the AI is failing or not working, then this is a safety issue. So my software per definition would always have some kind of risk-related activities. So this is still where I would be really happy if there's maybe in the future a bit more of clarification. If you're really talking about, does automatically all class 2A and higher devices fall into that scope, or would there be any exceptions? Because I do agree with you with class 1. In that case, we probably are on the safe side in many cases. At the same time, I think this will hurt many previously class 1 software manufacturers who are now in class 2A or even class 2B, because under MDD, it would have probably been not a high-risk device or AI in that case. And to really answer your question, I cannot give a proper answer on that, because if it really includes the conformity assessment body, then from a strict definition, they would be exempted from that, in my opinion. But at the same time, that wouldn't really make sense, because as you mentioned, that might be still a class 2A or even 2B device. It's just not following the regular conformity assessment procedure. So if we are taking the strict stance, I would say it's exempted from that. So they don't have to do it. But on the other hand, if we go more into the room of interpretation, it wouldn't really make sense, because then I hire a hospital and tell them, please, you develop it, so you don't have to do any of the regulatory procedures, and I'm a co-investor of the project or something like that. I would see some economic loopholes here that could emerge.
Yeah, and then I think one category we didn't really address is the other way around. Let's say you bring a software product to the market that uses AI and is used within healthcare, but is not a medical device. It's not necessarily not high risk. So the Annex 3 lays down additional categories that would potentially qualify certain products to still be considered high risk, even though it's not a medical device. So if you look at triaging systems, for example.
And so what you see is that possibly, go ahead. What you see is that possibly you get a divergence between the risk classification of medical devices and the risk classification with the AI technology that might be used then.
I mean, in regards of that, the EU AI Act doesn't really care if it's a 2A, 2B, or class 3 device. I think the big threshold would be if it is a class 1 device or not. Maybe that's the one big threshold the EU AI Act cares about. But no matter if you're having a medium risk AI supported device or a high risk support device in that case, it would be a high risk within the EU AI Act. And I think this is one point of critique, that why do you have these classes within the MDR if they are then again obsolete for another regulation or irrelevant? Because in both cases, we are talking about risk. The higher the general risk of my technology, the more documentation and market entry barriers you should be getting. But somehow the EU AI Act is now not ignoring, but somehow neglecting that fact that it doesn't matter if I'm really a high risk medical device or not, I will have to comply to the same requirements. Well, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I agree. Specifically, if you look at, for example, what the role of the AI system is specifically, right? It could have a very minor contribution to the overall functionality of the medical device, and still that AI would be seen as high risk just by the fact that it is within a medical device. Whereas the other way around, you could have a large component of the medical device being the main driver of a very safety critical function, and then that will be clearly in the same risk of high risk AI as the low risk AI component, and it would have to meet the same requirements, which you would have hoped, I guess, from a medical device perspective, that these classifications of medical devices to A to B, class 3 would have been translated in a similar level layer of requirements within the AI Act, but that's simply not the case.
And maybe we are having the same situation as we had with MDR a few years before, that even low-risk medical devices with class 1, for example, still have to do a lot of additional compliance they didn't have to do on the MDD. For example, having a full quality management system, that was not a thing for class 1 manufacturers before that. And I somehow feared, as you're saying, that even if I have just a tiny component in my whole system, and maybe that's 5% of the overall risk profile, I'll still have to go through the full regulation in that case and comply with 100% on that.
And I think similar, right, to your point, is what we're talking about, the quality system, technical documentation. I think the AI Act does something a little bit odd here, which is where it says that micro enterprises and small, medium enterprises, SMEs, might be eligible for having simplified manners of technical documentation and quality management systems. Although it's not clearly defined what that means yet, the interaction there between the MDR and the AI Act still remains to be seen.
Okay, we're getting one question here. Are old school medical devices that output a comparison of an individual measurement against a population norm within the scope of the AI Act? And if not, what would justify the exclusion given the broad definition? It's quite a big question.
I wasn't sure if I understood the first part. I understood the second part, but could you maybe repeat the first part again?
Yes. So are old school medical devices that output a comparison of an individual measurement against a population norm within the scope of the AI Act?
I'd be happy to give a first assessment and my first thinking, right? If you look at the actual definition that finally made it into the AI Act, and I think they made a nice last minute change, which is where they make it clear that the device may exhibit adaptiveness, for example, after deployment, and that for explicit or implicit objectives infers from the input it receives how to generate output, such as predictions, content, recommendations. If I read that definition, then I would say that if it's really deterministic in that sense, that it's not really applying a form of inference, as would be the case for AI systems. And in that case, I would say that this type of software should be excluded under the AI Act. But this is my personal opinion, and it remains to be seen how an authority would actually judge this. I'm not sure, Tibor, if you have a different view.
That would make sense, because unfortunately in this case we could only wait for maybe precedent cases by the European Court of Justice, or at least the national competent authority making a decision here. So that might be an approach, although I'm even skeptical or not aware of if competent authorities are prepared for these questions, because I know that even if they have to make decisions within the MDR scope, if something is a medical device, yes or no, and which class it might be, I'm pretty sure that if you go to 3 different competent authorities, you will get 3 different answers on many questions. So we don't really have alignment here. So I would agree with you, unless we don't have precedent cases, it would be possible to follow this assumption, but it would be necessary to keep an eye on any potential national or European updates on that, or even guidance document.
Yeah, indeed, because it's great, right? In the MDR, we also see that all borderline classification manual has just been transposed to the MDR as well, so that you have actually a guideline that sets precedents for these cases where, in case of doubt, then what do you do? Would it fall under the regulation or not? And we can only hope for that these issues that are being raised to competent authorities and the outcomes of those assessments are going to be made public as guidance for other people to understand, hey, how should I classify my device?
And this would be really something, if I could make recommendations, then this would be a recommendation that before the AI Act really is activated and companies have to comply with that, we at least have a few guidance documents, a few borderline cases that may be the most pressing ones, because we still have a bit of time left until the activation is here. But I would assume that manufacturers would be really happy about this, saying, okay, at least we have for the top 5 questions or more frequent questions, we get some answers, because unfortunately right now, none of us can really for sure say yes or no in that case. Because I'm not sure about your opinion, but I see that the EU AI Act was pushed through. I know that it is coming, but after reading it, at least maybe the first 10 articles, I had so many open questions. And I think this will be also the case for any other article. And this is maybe the problem, that at least with MDD, if we compare it again to MDD to MDR, we had some kind of previous legislation where we could say, okay, I think this is what MDR means, because MDD already had a lot of precedent cases and also guidance documents and so on. But I think this will be a really big challenge now for the EU AI Act, because this is a worldwide precedent case we didn't have before. So we cannot even go to other jurisdictions looking at their approaches because we are the first ones. So we have to do the pioneer work and interpret it.
And maybe that's a good step that we can make then to the topic on harmonized standards, right? Because you would hope that harmonized standards could fill in some of the blanks that we don't know yet. And if you look at what's being done today within harmonized standards and standards development, a few years ago, the SC42, that's the ISO committee that started the development of standards around AI, was very enthusiastic, developed quite a bunch of standards already to address some of the potential risks for AI. And then consequently, the AI Act started to become published. And consequently, what you saw is that the standards that were initially developed were not developed to address the issues that are now available within the AI Act. And the European Union within Sensenelec started the development of AI-specific standards for the European Union. And at the same time, the most of these participants that were active in SC42 are now also active within JC21 and are pushing on getting these ISO standards to become adopted within the European Union. So if you look at as an example, the IC ISO 42001, which aims to address quality management requirements, is really tailored to match as much as possible with ISO 9001, for example, but not really tailored to address the safety concerns that are now issued within the AI Act. And it remains to be seen how this standard will have a position within the European Union. So within JC21, they can decide to adopt this standard as a European standard, but then will that standard be sufficient in the view of the European Commission to fulfill the role under the AI Act? And if that's not going to be the case, then how do manufacturers need to address this? And if you look at the timelines, and this is my expectation, is that the AI Act, and I've read various articles where they made that reference, it's expected to come into force somewhere in June this year, with a transition period of around 2 to 3 years, depending on whether you're high risk under Annex 3 or whether you're high risk under Annex 1. If 3 years and ISO 42001 is going to be proven insufficient, then with a main throughput timeline from a standard from start to actual publication can take somewhere up to 5 years, and we will not see standards being ready before the actual implementation of the AI Act. And in the earlier request, the European Commission already requested the standards to be available in April of next year. So I think we'll be in the dark for quite a while, and hopefully we'll see some guidance as soon as possible. And maybe for the interim period, we'll see some MDCG guidance to help us to clarify how we need to address those questions from the AI Act until clear standards are in place.
I think that's a very interesting point there. And in general, for medical device manufacturers implementing AI technology, what would be a good strategy at this point to address the fact that we don't have the harmonized standards yet? Even the set of harmonized standards under the NDR is still being populated. So we will have a very short transition period. 2 years, 3 years is not a lot of time. We know that from experience. So what would be the best approach at this point to start getting ready to start implementing changes into the existing quality management systems, ISMS, and the documentation regarding the devices, while we are waiting for guidances and standards to be published?
So maybe, three solutions come to my mind, and I will start with the worst ones, in my opinion, and try to get to the better ones. So I think the worst scenario would be definitely to just hope and wait, and just say, okay, somehow there will be some miracle that we will be ready in time. I would definitely not recommend that strategy, because conformity assessment bodies and even maybe national competent authorities will simply not care if there are standards available or not in a harmonized way. So I know this might be tempting, saying, okay, dear regulation, if you don't provide me guidance, I will just wait and try to wait for that. I think we had a similar situation back then with the GDPR. when it came into effect, many companies said, I would just wait and sit it out and see what's happening. But we have seen that, unfortunately, this strategy isn't working too well. So that would be the one I would definitely not recommend to do. The second one is still, in my opinion, not the best one, is to try to ignore available standards, even if they are not harmonized, and say, I will try to do my own strategy because maybe in my team I do have AI experts, and ask them to write special white papers or SOPs or even minimum requirements. I mean, you can do that. But on the other hand, how many real true experts will you have who are not only great in developing and working with the AI, but are also excellent in documenting and maybe creating requirements, specifications, and so on? And number one, in my opinion, would be that even though many standards are not harmonized yet, we already do have guidance documents, for example. Unfortunately, not really in the EU, but maybe in the US and also in China for medical devices and AI. So at least we have some guidances from other jurisdictions, from other regulations, and we also do have some standards. And even if they don't really fit maybe into the EU AI Act, they're better than nothing. So I personally would really go through this list of guidance documents and also standards, pick the ones where I as an organization would really say, that makes sense. Yeah, I could fit it into my company or into my QMS, for example, and try to work with that. Because we have one advantage, we can talk about state of the art. And state of the art doesn't mean that we always have to take the top-notch solution or the most sci-fi solution. But if we say that the state of the art currently is maybe this one standard, even though it's not specialized for medical devices or the EU AI Act, we could call this as a state of the art. And maybe that's the safety measure we can do. That even though there might be maybe 40 AI standards, maybe, or I would have to double check how many there are, if only 2 of them are used regularly or are already known to the broad public, then this could be our solution to say, then we use these 2 until we get potentially more guidance or official standards here. So that's my 3-step approach, how I would do that in this case.
Yeah, I can add slightly. First thing, I totally agree with what you're saying, 100%. So I don't have a lot to add. The only thing that I can say is, at the end of the day, right, the primary aim of a regulation, and irrespective of having guidance standards available, is to meet compliance with the regulation itself. So yeah, and not having standards, not having guidance is going to make it very hard. And yeah, having the best standards that are available today already, use those, as you mentioned. And one thing I would try to do as a manufacturer is also use common sense. If you're making a medical device that includes AI, there will be specific risks that are related to the use of AI, and you probably know as a manufacturer what those risks are already. So don't exclude those from your standard risk assessment, and have a look specifically at the additional topics that are being requested by the AI Act. So for example, the AI Act requests to consider fundamental rights, for example, and risks to fundamental rights. And it asks you, and as part of those fundamental rights, potentially also risks with regard to the environment. These kind of subjects you can already start including in your risk assessments today. And you will need to do that anyway at some point in order to demonstrate compliance against the Act. And don't be surprised that your notified body will start asking for how you conform with these specific requirements, because they will need to make the transition. Yeah, so similar answer.
I think indeed risks is also a topic that is quite important, both within the medical device field as now in the AI Act. And we got a question on that from the audience. Any comments on the different approaches to risk that is used in the EU AI Act versus the MDR? Because indeed, medical devices, this industry is used to dealing with risk assessments, risk analysis, has their own standards for it. And now we have the AI Act that is coming from a different angle. So any comments on how to approach the differences there and fit it into one medical device file in the end?
So maybe I would like to quickly start with that. What I would definitely do in that situation is that if I primarily develop a medical device, and this is the case because this is also the topic of our webinar, I cannot simply now say that I maybe don't address the MDR requirements properly anymore because there are differences in the EU AI Act and so on. In that case, I would definitely give priority to risk management approaches, such as with ISO 14971, for example. And what I would be then trying is to, since I already have to do a risk file within my technical documentation, I would pick those elements from the EU AI Act and try to expand my current documentation with that. Because what for me wouldn't be logical is that I'm primarily focusing on a medical device, which by accident also falls into the scope of the EU AI Act. And then I start to heavily modify my MDR requirements regarding technical documentation. So it fits into the perfect alignment of the EU AI. I would do it the other way around, because let's be honest, if you're also having other components which might fall into the machine directive, for example, you also don't say, okay, I ignore MDR, I'm now following the structure and requirements of the machine directive. On the contrary, you will just put it additionally into your technical file, that you show that you're also complying with that one. So Leon, I don't know how you see it, but that would be my approach to do.
Yeah, I largely agree. And I think maybe I can address in the same answer one of the questions that are coming in via the questions, which is whether if you're a manufacturer, right, what are the state-of-the-art guidance documents that you should already pay close attention to under the AI Act, for example, ISO norms, FDA guidance, etc. And I think that makes full sense, right? So consider already what's there. And if you look at, for example, one of the guidance documents that's now being created.
I'm sorry, yeah, Tatiana has joined us on the line. She wasn't able to log in, and that's her. So she's available on the phone now to join the discussion. Sorry about that, everybody.
Tatiana, can you hear us then? Okay, let's just continue. If Tatiana, if you want to drop in, feel free.
With the interruption music.
Exactly. Okay. So I was going to say, and going back to the question, right? There's already standards that are being developed, also with that which are being tailored towards medical devices. For example, we've seen the AMI BSI standard, the 34971 on risk management, that is right now being adopted, or at least there's a new working item proposal that I think is being drafted in TC62, where they will try to transpose that into an ISO standard or an ISO technical report. These kind of standards can really help you to already address AI risks in your risk management file, to get a risk management file that at the end of the day is going to concern AI. But again, also this standard is having a similar problem as the other standards that were previously designed under SC42, which is that they were designed prior to having the AI Act, so they're not necessarily going to help you to support full compliance with the AI Act. And there's a bunch of others. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I apologize that for technical connections and interruption. I'm trying, because you don't see me, so it's very difficult to come into discussion. But if you allow me, I will kind of catch up on the standards and the discussion about risk management. So basically, the ideas you have said, and I've heard most of the conversation you had, but I couldn't intervene. But indeed, the main idea of overall logic of the Act, and this also applies to standards, is the complementarity. So as you know, the Act follows new legislative framework, which means that different pieces of legislation can apply to the same product. So in that sense, the whole logic and idea of the Act was to ensure that MDR, it applies to specific hazards and overall safety of the medical device product, while AI Act adds an additional layer, as has been mentioned already, to address specific risks related to AI technologies. Maybe just a small addition to what have been discussed before about the classification of medical AI-enabled medical devices as high risk. Here again, the complementarity plays a very important role. On one hand, risk determination is fully in accordance with the sectoral legislation. So in this case, with medical device regulation. So according to Act Article 6, if medical device is subject to third-party conformity assessment, it will be one of the elements to classify as a high risk, but it's not the only element. So the AI system must also have a safety function. So it must be so the product must be subject to third-party conformity assessment and the medical device regulation, but it also must play a safety function. So that, I guess, relates to one of the comments mentioned by Leon, where what is not clear, what is high risk or what is not high risk. So not every AI-enabled medical device which is subject to third-party conformity assessment will become necessarily a high risk. So this safety component is kind of a filter. And of course, it's not yet maybe clear, and we would need to work closely with medical device coordination group and more generally to provide more guidelines exactly on the type of classifications. But just already to say that we were indeed in drafting the Act thinking about providing this kind of filter. As you know, for Annex 3, we have a filter introduced in Annex 3 in Article 7 to make sure that not every AI system is automatically a high risk. And for AI-enabled products, this kind of filter is to a certain extent is safety function or safety component which AI would play. And what relates to standards, indeed, now there is very heated phase, and standards will become very important element of compliance, and we work very closely with Senelec on this, and of course international dimensions plays a role. But here I want to highlight that AI Act is based on the same logic as medical device regulation, and in that sense it's based on product safety legislation logic, which is very important for the standards specifically in relation to risk management systems and quality management systems, because of course the standards which have been mentioned, which developed in context SC 42, for example, on risk management 42001, is based on a different logic, is not based on the product safety legislation logic. Therefore, it will not be sufficient, as I think also mentioned by Leon, to comply with the requirements, for example, of Article 9 of AI Act or even Article 17 of AI Act. And sorry, I'm trying to condense all the questions I couldn't intervene on, so maybe I stop here, but I'm now online, so just signal when I can come in.
Just to come back to safety component, it's indeed described, it's within the scope of the AI Act, but there was one question from the participants. What can we consider a safety component within a medical device? Because in the MDR, it's less clearly described what could be a safety component under the AI Act and then linked to the MDR.
Mm-hmm. So this is one of the priority questions which we will address in guidance. So not only for medical devices, but including for medical device regulation. Our tentative planning as a commission to really start to work on this guidance already as early as this summer or latest autumn, to provide really guidance and practical examples on what we will classify as a safety component. And here may be important to mention that, of course, AI Act is a horizontal legislation. So we have very general definition of the safety component, but we would need to elaborate on this definitely more, and we understand this importance, and this will be one of the guidance on which we will work together with medical device coordination group experts.
Yeah, I think this is super useful clarification. Thanks a lot, Tatjana, because it's really helpful, I think, also for the manufacturers that are here on the call to understand what this will mean, and also for me, the clarification that that safety component part will be an important element to consider, whether your device is actually going to be regulated on the AI Act or not. until now has not been so clear when reading the AI Act, especially because considering that the safety component aspect doesn't really exist within the MDR. So that's really useful. Thanks for that feedback.
Yes. No, that more comes from other safety legislation, but indeed you need to have two, as I mentioned, and I think that's very important indeed, that you have to have two elements together. So you need to be subject to third-party conformity assessment, and AI system must be safety component, or fulfill the safety function of overall products. So indeed, those two elements need to be cumulatively present.
Yeah. And looking, I think from a standards perspective, right, as you mentioned as well, is that the ISO 13485 and the 14971, they're very clearly designed to address safety concerns with regards to medical devices. And in that sense, I think they can already play an enormous role in addressing the concerns that are set out in the AI Act too. And then if you look at the AI Act, and I think I mentioned it just before, right, the risks I think that the European Commission has asked specific attention to for AI systems are fundamental rights, for example, the environment. And those are aspects that you can already address today within the 14971 standard. And I hope that the added standard is now under the development, or is going to be developed, which is going to be, I think, a technical specification, the ISO 24971-2, that could address potentially these questions. And maybe we'll see similar references to these kind of standards from the standards being developed in HHC 21 and SC 42. And in that sense, because one of the questions in the chat is also with regard to what are the most essential lifecycle standards that should be applied when they are harmonized, if they are going to be harmonized. But that is still super unclear, I would say, from my perspective. But I think manufacturers should just be very smart in using the standards that we already have today for medical devices and trying to understand what the main risks are with regards to the AI and try to embed those specific risk aspects into their existing quality management systems and risk management systems and technical documentation.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a correct approach. And what we now, I mean, of course, Commission is not the standard setting organization. We work closely with Sensenelec, but it's Sensenelec which develops the standards. But in terms of indeed the logic, the regulatory logic, indeed the standards for medical quality management system and risk management system ISO standards, which are now harmonized standards at the EU, of course, they follow much closer the logic of AI Act than, for example, standards which have been recently adopted at ISO level related to management systems, like I mentioned for the 2001, for example. So in that sense, from the Commission side, we very much try to explain and push to follow exactly the product safety legislation as in the medical device regulation and as in the applicable standards. Indeed, there are the existing standards will not fully will be sufficient, to apply to address the risks related to AI systems which we have in AI Act, but it's a very good basis. So basically what we try to develop is that now with AI related standards, an additional layer, as you mentioned, Leon, related, for example, to fundamental rights would be further spelled out, and additional elements we have in AI Act. But generally the system, yes, the logic of the system is very much aligned between MDR and AI Act.
Okay, good. So looking at the time, we maybe can still give some advice from a practical point of view. So we have the legislative text, we have standards coming, some are existing, and so on. So what steps can companies take to monitor and adapt to what is there today, what is being amended, what is coming? So at this point, what can they do? What are, let's say, practical tools, methodologies to ensure that they are compliant today and stay compliant in the near future and far future? So maybe Tatiana first, and then we can all address this question.
No, I think it's good to start thinking, and that webinar as we organized today is very good because, of course, we have 36 months after entry into force of AI Act, but this time, of course, will go fast. So, in order to prepare already, it's very good that companies already start to prepare in terms of really reviewing the existing processes and procedures, and of course to see how the requirements of AI Act will impact the existing processes. Like I said, what we try to do from regulatory perspective is really to minimize as much as possible regulatory burden. So the whole idea of AI Act is really complementarity in all possible aspects. So we don't require completely new risk management system or new quality management system, but of course AI Act would add certain obligations like logging, like additional requirements related to risk management systems, specifically related to risks, specific risk of AI systems. So all of this requires analysis and reflection, and of course it depends on the current state of play for the specific providers, of medical devices. The good thing, like I said, complementarity, that existing structures, the existing conformity assessment bodies will be the responsible conformity assessment bodies also under AI Act. So structures and the procedures, I would say, are very familiar, should be familiar for medical device regulation industry. So from that sense, I would say that the medical device industry has, we could say, competitive advantage vis-a-vis other regulated products because it's really closely aligned with the logic and the structure of what you have now.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Tibor? Practical tips.
Yeah, from a pragmatic approach, I would do two things. If I would tomorrow develop a new medical device that is AI supported, number one, I would definitely first check the scope of the EU AI Act and check, is it really within the scope or not? Because this is what we've discussed before. I really have to be sure that I'm falling within or outside of the scope, because it doesn't help if I make some basic assumptions and 6 months later I say, oh no, I misjudged, or I had the wrong assumption on that. Number two, and I think this is also a thing still many people don't do with the medical device regulation, is please read through the AI Act. Even if it's long, even if it's detailed, even if you need more than, I don't know, a few hours to go through, what I commonly see even with the MDR is that people are not really reading through the actual requirements of the regulation, but try to Google simple solutions or just ask, ironically, ChatGPT, provide me the most important information, what I have to do, and so on. And they then don't really have a feeling for what is actually written in the EU AI Act, for example, or MDR or not. And then if interpretation begins, because they don't have the proper basic information, then you misalign something or go into a wrong direction. And I know this sounds simple, but I can tell you I meet so many people who never really fully read MDR and have been in the industry for so many years now, where I'm really surprised that this is one of your main businesses, to at least read this basic document. Because of course you cannot read thousands of pages, but if you don't read thousands of pages, at least read the basic regulation. So that would be number one. And number two would be that even if you don't have to do it monthly, I would assume that as a medical device manufacturer, you already have some kind of regulatory monitoring system. Because of course you also have to check, for example, if MDR is updated or if any standards are updated. There it would be really good to also adopt the strategy for the EU AI Act, because on the EURLEX website, you get RSS feed opportunities. You have companies such as Estonian Standards, for example, that provide you also with a monitoring possibility for your standards. And what we have also heard today, and I would strongly recommend that, check really what technical committees are working on standards for AI, and they also have the functionality that you get informed if any of the currently prepared standards are adopted, changed, withdrawn, and so on. So you don't have to do that maybe on a weekly basis, but maybe for the next few, I would say, quarters, you should do it at least on a quarterly basis to get a good basic information on everything.
And you, Leon?
Yeah, maybe
Any
I can add one thing.
Advice?
one very practical thing to what Tibor mentioned is the timelines are going to be short. We'll have a 3 years transition timeline. We've seen how that went with medical devices. This is not a huge amount of time. Notified bodies will need to get up classified, or how you say it, uplifted to also be able to assess against the requirements of the AI Act. If you know your device will fall under it, start making a plan on how you're going to comply over the next years and inform management teams. They will need to set aside resources. They will need to know that this is going to be in your scope of your daily activities as a regulatory affairs person. And with standards coming out, that's going to take time. The adoption is going to take time. Maybe you need to make adjustments to the device in order to comply with the new regulation. For example, Tatjana mentioned it just now, logging requirements. Does your device already comply with these type of requirements? Can it already log the information that is going to be demanded by the AI Act? You don't want to find out in 2 years from now that you still need to make adjustments to your device to even comply to the AI Act. And you don't want to bring that message in 2 years from now to your management team that you are too late to prepare. So start it, and this is, I think, crucial. Inform management teams, give them training, make sure that they understand what's coming, because they might not be regulatory enthusiasts as we are ourselves. Well, I can speak for myself and ourselves here, but I think that many people in regulatory can be enthusiastic about law. So, but then bring the rest of the organization along in that transition.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I can add one for myself as well. I think it's also important to keep learning and keep investigating. Webinars like we did today, even for us as speakers, I think we learned a lot from each other. So trying to get that information from people that are part of the European Commission, like Tatjana, that are sitting in technical standard committees and so on. I mean, they can provide you information that is not always clear by just reading the text as well. So in addition to really trying to understand and reading the requirements as they are defined, learning from people with additional knowledge and background information can also help. And so with that, I think we can wrap it up from our side. I want to thank everybody for joining. I still want to mention 2 more things. In the follow-up email, we will also provide you with a link to a global market survey on the software in and as medical devices. If you complete it, we will also provide you with the report, of course. And we will also provide you with a link to a first article in a blog series that we did together with Leon on the AI Act and the different aspects. So for those who want to read more about it, you can also dive into this. And with that, I want to give it back to Rick, and I guess we still might be able to answer a few questions, and afterwards we can also, in follow-up communication, try to address remaining questions if needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, panel. That was a really interesting discussion and a really hot topic, so well done. We do have time for a couple of quick questions, and just, kind of starting at the top. Do you guys, is there any comments on the different approaches to risk that is used by the EU AI Act versus MDR?
Maybe it's an excellent
Leon,
question.
I think you actually,
Yeah,
you already.
Yeah.
Okay, we addressed that. I apologize.
Maybe another one I would like to answer. There was one question about how notified bodies and maybe auditors would react or would expect during regarding the documentation. So, I mean, here the answer is the better the basic documentation is. Let's say the written documentation, the less necessity on average there might be to really go into detail. Because even if you're now submitting a technical file to a notified body and you've written 50,000 lines of code, it will not happen that the product reviewer will go through each and every line and check if that's okay or not. The most common reason why auditors would maybe go really in depth into your training data and check if it's really existing, if it makes sense or not, if you're having a poor general documentation. So if you provide an excellent basic documentation which makes sense, then maybe in my case, I would be happy with a sampling, saying, yeah, just give me some samples of your training data and how you used it and what format it might have. But if you're having a terrible documentation and I have no idea what you have done, I might ask you to provide more evidence because I have to go more in depth. So that would be my perspective on that. The better your basic documentation, the less probable it will be that you really have to provide each and every data set. But this is my current auditor's perspective. It might happen that there will be official updates that might contradict that in a few months or years. So this is just my current view on that topic.
If I may maybe quickly jump into that. Indeed, I think you very well summarized. The whole purpose of AI Act, of course, is to ensure that the AI systems are trustworthy. So it also applies then to AI-enabled devices. So, and the purpose of technical documentation is really to ensure that that in that sense, conformity assessment and notified body auditors understand what is the content of the system. So the more clear technical documentation outlines it, that it is. And I think in the recital we even mentioned that kind of, you know, it should be written in a way that is understandable. Exactly. So as mentioned, if you provide pages of code, you know, maybe it's not everyone would understand. So the idea is, of course, to facilitate this kind of explainability of the system. So to the extent possible, of course, and with the technical limitations which complex system may have, but still that's the idea. Maybe just also a small point on the previous question which we discussed, but I think the concept of risk and definition of risk is very much aligned with between AI Act and MDR, and for that reason, the follow-up discussions we had and we already exchanged on the compatibility of the overall approach and standards for that matter, because it follows the same foundations. Yes, thank you.
Okay. And what I would probably suggest is since that there's a follow-up going out with the recording and the polling and that sort of thing, you're going to have your contact details available, and I think any further questions can be directed to you, and that you could then address them to the rest of the panel and do a good follow-up that way. Does that make sense?
Yes, sure. Yes, that's something we can do for sure. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, we're on the top of the hour. So, you know, that just keeps us on schedule. I mean, there's been some interesting and good questions. Again, the dialogue and the topic has been fantastic. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank Matrix Requirements for underwriting this program and making it possible. And want to wish everyone a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.